Today's episode is made possible by Northwestern University Press and their new release, More Than Meat and Raiment, poems by Illinois Poet Laureate Angela Jackson. More Than Meat and Raiment draws on imagery from the African-American South and the South Side of Chicago, storytelling, the Black arts movement, and Hausa folklore. Deftly intertwining narrative and free verse, Jackson expresses the complexities, beauty, and haunts of the multi-layered Black voice. Listeners receive a 20% discount on More Than Meat and Raiment or any other title with promo code POD20. This offer is available at nupress.northwestern.edu. Today's episode is also brought to you by Bianca Stone's What is Otherwise Infinite, a collection of poems which Dorothea Lasky calls legendary. Written in 4 sections with incisive and vivid lyrical language, Stone's poems consider how we find our place in the world through themes of philosophy, religion, environment, myth, and psychology. Says Eileen Miles, "This is like moral Baroque and also an invitation to make things. I feel enclosed by something guiding here in these poems, which feels deeply experienced, and it may sound corny, but I think Bianca Stone is raising the possibility that writing poems or writing these poems is an opportunity to give. Does that constitute a philosophy or a craft? She's making that. What is Otherwise Infinite is out now from Tin House." Having a conversation with the inimitable Rabih Alameddine is a long-time dream of mine, and now finally a dream fulfilled that I can share with you today. As you'll soon see, one of the things we discuss in today's conversation is the unusual way he positions the writer and the narrator in service of finding the right distance to tell a story that is very important for him to tell. In the process of us exploring this, I mention one of his favorite poets, Fernando Pessoa, who, like no other, has explored narrative distance from self by creating over 70 different heteronyms with their own biographies, whether a bisexual naval engineer in Scotland or a mystical shepherd or a doctor and classicist living in exile in Brazil after supporting a failed royalist coup. All of these heteronyms wrote very different writings from each other. They translated each other, wrote the prefaces for each other's collections, and more. Pessoa is not the topic of today's conversation, but rather something that comes up in passing. But it is also what Rabih chose to contribute to the bonus audio archive, where he talks about the importance of Pessoa for him and reads from one of his poems, or you could say from one of Alberto Caeiru's poems, depending on how you view it. The bonus audio is one of many potential benefits of becoming a listener supporter of the show, including becoming an early reader for Tin House, receiving 12 books over the course of a year, months before the general public, to rare collectibles from everyone from Nikki Finney to Ursula K. Le Guin. And every supporter helps with the ongoing collective brainstorm of who to invite to come on the show going forward, as well as receiving a resource-filled email with each episode containing things referenced in the conversation and the best things I discovered as I prepared for it. So head over to patreon.com/betweenthecovers and check it all out, and consider starting the new year as part of the Between the Covers community. And now for today's episode with Rabih Alameddine. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is writer Rabih Alameddine. Born in Jordan to Lebanese parents, raised in Kuwait and Lebanon, a short stint in England, and finally settling in California, his home until recently for many decades. Alameddine did not take a traditional American route to writing either. Studying engineering at UCLA, getting a master's of business in San Francisco, tending bar, becoming a well-respected painter, and one of the founding members of the gay soccer team, the San Francisco Spikes, the second oldest inclusive club in the country, a team that won the inaugural Gay Olympic Games in 1982, again in 86, and when a national gay soccer tournament was formed in 87, the San Francisco Spikes were regular winners there too. Frustrated with the type of writing he was seen depicting the AIDS epidemic, Rabih Alameddine wrote his first novel, Kool-Aids, in response, a book that grapples with both AIDS and the Lebanese Civil War, and which was a finalist for the 1999 Lambda Literary Award. He's also the author of the short story collection The Perv, the novel I, the Divine, a novel in first chapters, the international bestseller The Hakawati, which garnered him the Rome Prize in 2009, and his much lauded An Unnecessary Woman, whose protagonist was a blue-haired, AK-47-toting, 70-something-year-old Lebanese translator and recluse who never published what she wrote. Winner of the 2016 Prix Femina in France, a prize decided each year by an exclusively female jury, it was also a finalist for the National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and a PEN Open Book Award, and it won the Arab-American Book Award and the California Book Award. His next book, The Angel of History, also won the Arab-American Book Award and the Lambda Literary Award, and his body of work has won the John Dos Passos Prize for Literature, a Guggenheim, and recently a Lannan Literary Fellowship. And if there were an award for the most salutary reason to be on Twitter, where he curates the most wonderful cascading streams of poetry and paintings, he would have won that too. As he says in one of his bios, Rabih Alameddine currently divides his time between his bedroom and his living room, and he also teaches creative writing at the University of Virginia. Alameddine is here today to talk about his latest novel, The Wrong End of the Telescope, with starred reviews from Publishers Weekly, Kirkus, The Library Journal, and Shelf Awareness, rave reviews from everyone from The Guardian to the New York Times Book Review. Rebecca Mackay says, Rabih Alameddine is a master of both the intimate and the global, and The Wrong End of the Telescope finds him at the top of his craft. A story of rescue, identity, deracination, and connection, this novel is timely and urgent and a lot of fun. Eileen Miles adds, The Wrong End of the Telescope is the best kind of prose. Lines break out like poetry, and the story muscles on, telling. The setting is real history, which I'm hungry for, and Rabih Alameddine queers it handsomely with all kinds of love and a feeling that existence is pure experience, not language at all, and the shape of this book, right up to the end, is a becoming. Finally, Dina Nayeri for the New York Times says, Alameddine's irreverent prose evokes the old master storytellers from my own Middle Eastern home, their observations toothy and full of wit, returning always to human absurdity. Again and again our narrator, Dr. Mina, cracks open the strange, funny, and cruel social mores of East and West. She shows us that acceptance and rejection exist across borders and often manifest in surprising ways. Welcome to Between the Covers, Rabih Alameddine.
Thank you so much. Every time I get introduced, it's shocking, and it's like, is that me they're talking about?
Well, indeed it is. But in talking about you and identity, the narrator and main protagonist of our story is Mina, a Lebanese-American doctor who is trans and a lesbian and who hasn't been back to Lebanon in decades because she was disowned by much of her family. And she's heading to Lesbos to lend her medical skills to help with the Syrian refugee crisis that has found the island its focal point. But she herself had no intention of doing anything other than practicing medicine. She didn't intend on being the storyteller of the book that we have. But she's tasked by a writer who has tried to tell the story and can't do it. A writer who, while a secondary character in your book, and is always sort of persistently in the margins of the book in a significant way, as sort of a mystery and an absence. So I was hoping maybe we could start with you reading the short chapter, "You Made Me Do It," as I feel like this chapter sets up not only the form of the book, but also raises so many questions about writing and how to write, and also how meaningful or meaningless writing might be.
You made me do it. You suggested I write this. You, the writer, couldn't. You tried writing the refugee story. Many times, many different ways. You failed. And failed again. Maybe failed better. Still, you couldn't. More than 2 years after you and I met in Lesbos, you were still trying. You tackled it from one direction, then another, to no avail. You were too involved, unable to disentangle yourself from the tale. You said you couldn't calibrate the correct distance. You weren't able to find the right words, even after numerous sessions on your psychiatrist's couch. I should write this thing, you told me. You called it a thing, flicking your hand with a dismissive Levantine gesture. Every idiot thinks they're a writer, they're not. Every dullard thinks they have a tale to tell, they don't. But I should. I have a good one. You insisted I write the refugee story, as well as your story and mine. This thing. I told you I wasn't a writer. I could form sentences, present ideas, and so forth, but not write a memoir or a book that anyone could necessarily want to read. Who said anything about publishing, you said? I should write my story. No one has to read it. There are enough books out there, you said. Why add more? I should write to make sense of the world, to grasp my story. Writing simplifies life, you said, forces coherence on discordant narratives, unless it doesn't. And most of the time it doesn't, because really, how can one make sense of the senseless? One puts a story in a linear order, posits cause and effect, and then thinks one has arrived. Writing one story narcotizes it. Literature today is an opiate. You contradict yourself all the time. You know that, right? I know, you are large, like Whitman. You contain multitudes. If writing my story will not simplify my life, will not make more sense of my narrative, if I can't publish and become a gazillionaire, why should I do it? Memory is a wound, you said, and some things are released only by the act of writing. Unless I go in with my scalpel and suction to excavate, to clean, to bring into light, that wound festers, and the gangrene of decay will eat me alive. And whatever you do, you said, don't fucking call it a Lebanese lesbian in Lesbos, just don't. I'm writing now. I'll tell your tale and mine. I'll write your story for you. I plunge.
We've been listening to Rabih Alameddine read from The Wrong End of the Telescope. So you've talked before about how you need a certain distance to be able to write about something, that it can't be too distant, but you also can't be too enmeshed, something that you've called the Goldilocks distance. In light of what you just read, can you talk about the Goldilocks distance?
Sure.
And whether this handing off of the story from the writer to the surgeon is part of that process for you with this book?
It was definitely, I don't know if it was part of the process as much as it was the process for me. I had been working with refugees for a long time. And by working primarily, I was just interviewing refugees. Whenever I went to Lebanon in the beginning, there were so many and they were all over the place. It was easy to just talk to them. And then I did officially a couple of times with UNHCR But then the crisis in Lesbos happened, and I went there, and I had some, shall we say, issues. But the whole time, I was trying to write something about the refugees. A couple of newspapers asked, and I wasn't able to. I was not able to. I tried so many different times. I think I successfully wrote maybe two stories, one essay, two essays basically. And one was a silly thing about just asking refugee kids who they're supporting for the World Cup. I wasn't able to write it. It was difficult. Everything I wrote was shit. Just everything was just terrible. Because there were many issues I had by the time I went to Lesbos, but primarily it was that I began to see my family, coming as refugees. It's like it was looking at my people coming across, and I was on the other side in some ways. So I wasn't able to extricate myself to see what the volunteers were doing, what the refugees were doing. It became too confusing. And then I was writing this other story, and Mina, the character, was part of that story, and it had nothing to do with the novel. And all of a sudden, Mina slowly migrated from that story into the novel. And once she came on board, as I like to call it, or she began to tell the story, even though, of course, it's me, I'm not completely crazy. I was able to distance myself. And primarily, it was, her character, she had the ability to actually be separate. I always envisioned her as, she's a surgeon. So, all these things that the writer would go through, she would go through, but she'd be able to put them aside and do her job. Whereas the writer, like most writers, is a little bit too self-involved and just thinks the world ends with his trauma. So it was that contrast and her ability to get into the situation, feel the same things, but able to write about it. And that to me was just the right amount of distance for the book. The distance is a big thing. I've always said that if one has to write about one's family and one is, too close, or the family is too close, it's really difficult to write about it. But then if you're, completely the black sheep and just separated, you can't write about it either. One is you're too in it to see it, the other you're too far away to see it. So it's this one foot in either, or, what is the right distance to be able to see something. And yeah, I call it the Goldilocks distance, and it's different for every writer. Every writer has their different way of being.
Well, this choice reminded me of Vivian Gornick's book, The Situation and the Story, which
absolutely, which is one of, and that first chapter, that introductory is brilliant.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, she's writing about nonfiction, but she puts forth the notion that even memoirists need to create a persona from which to write, from which to take their life material and compose it, that a memoirist still has to choose from which one of their selves that they're writing from, and also which vantage point in time, even which may be a different vantage point from the actual time they're writing in.
And that is so true for me. But what I also notice is that each situation and each story that you're telling it requires a different kind of distance. And that, I think, is being able to know what your distance is extremely important.
Yeah. Well, she talks about the type of persona in nonfiction as an unsurrogated persona versus the surrogated persona of fiction. And what's interesting about this choice you made in that you introduce us to in the chapter that you read is we have the writer character who may or may not be an unsurrogated persona or a surrogated persona, but you invite us to confuse him with you as an unsurrogated persona, insofar as he shares many of the identifiable broad stroke details of your life, whether it be his work with Syrian refugees in Lebanon or his fabulous spectacles. So we can connect the secondary character to you. But what's also interesting is that many of the people you've been in conversation with around this book, particularly the ones who know you well in real life, see so much of Mina, the surrogated persona. They see so much of you in Mina. And I wondered if maybe you could speak to having these two personas, if perhaps the story is being told through the gaps in the interplay between these two characters, and also between a doer and a observer.
This is, shall we say, a loaded question, because a lot of what the novel is about, what can you observe, what can you be witness to, and what can be done as to sort of the interaction between the observer and the doer. And that's always a difficult thing. But yes, I don't know whether I am limited in my imagination, or that this is what works best. But most of my characters are sort of me. The big hint is that I always write in the first person. I've had some short stories in third person, but for the most part, I write in first person. I inhabit the character. At the same time, I think I've said this a couple of times, that when I start to write and when things are working, I become the character. But I also see the character next to me as I'm working. So it's both at the same time. And in this novel, it works that way, as in there is Mina who's, I'm inhabiting, and then there is the writer who's sort of me. Although, it's supposed to not be completely me or whatever, but, it's closer to me than so that this dichotomy of the two of us observing gives a multiple angle or a multiple point of view to what is going on. And, again, I don't have to keep mentioning that it's, the wrong end of the telescope. It's that, it's not even, I was thinking that it's not even one telescope. There should be many, but from that point of view, and then those 2 point of views, and then there are multiple sort of characters within the book who begin to tell you some things about what happened. So there's those point of views. In most novels do that. In this novel, I try to show that, to show clearly that they're different point of views, and the sort of the tension or sometimes lack of between Mina, the main narrator, and the writer, who may or may not be the narrator, is I was interested in that the whole time.
It was also really fun the ways that Mina lovingly makes fun of the writer.
Well, the trouble was that, shall we say, I was highly, highly judgmental of the writer. It's like, I'm not going to say the self-loathing came to the surface, but some form of loathing came to the surface. And it was interesting that I was just smacking into this character, the poor thing. Then the more I sort of wanted to strangle the character, the more loving Mina became in the book towards the character. And I started thinking, oh my God, this is like, it's like my therapist was going to have a field day with this one, yeah. And at times I started thinking, oh my God, I made Mina like not just an admirer of this writer's works, but a fan, a big fan. she's trying to, as much as she keeps, making fun of him, she's trying to prop him up. And I thought, my God, people will look at it and think, I wrote a fan of me into my work.
It
But
doesn't come across that way,
unfortunately,
though.
huh?
I don't think it comes across like she's just,
Well, that's the thing.
yeah,
It didn't matter in the end. It worked. It worked.
yeah,
It was like I felt that it worked. That uh, she in the narrator saved the writer character. She's the one who basically props him up. Takes over in some ways.
yeah.
So it's both on the page and in my head. Mm.
Well, perhaps my favorite conversation you've had around the book, it was this really wonderful one with Kara Walker,
Mm.
someone you first met when she was visiting Lebanon in 2010, and you showed her around. And because Lebanon is home to 1.5 million Syrian refugees and 0.5 million Palestinian refugees, 2 million refugees in a country of a population of only 6 million. One of the things that and also because you have spent a good amount of time working with Syrian refugees there, as you mentioned, a part of you showing her around was showing her some of these camps. And this is what she said about the visit. I remember almost nothing about the visit. It exists in my mind as a montage of impressions, textures, and gestures until the moment Alameddine showed me a shanty town of migrant workers whose invisibility was a contrast to the more quote unquote established Palestinian refugee camps. But you tell her that when you went to Lesbos, which you've sort of alluded to in your opening comments, when you went to Lesbos joining some of your friends who were there to help, you thought that because of your past experience with the Syrian refugees in Beirut, that you'd arrive and you'd hit the ground running. But when you arrived, you instead felt a complete loss of self like you've never experienced before. And you say to Kara, quote, I didn't understand who I was or what I was doing there. Am I Lebanese? Am I an American? Do I belong with the refugees or do I belong with the volunteers? And our writer, surrogated or unsurrogated writer in the book, seems similarly unmoored, not knowing how to meaningfully engage with the scenario. But it raises the question that I'm curious about is, given your experience working with Syrian refugees in previous to going to Lesbos, can you speak a little bit to what the difference was for you, where in one situation you were unmoored around your sense of self and in another you weren't?
Primarily, again, in the beginning, I was in Lebanon. We were all, in many ways, one people. The difference between Syrian and Lebanese is big, but it's still, not the difference between Middle Eastern and Westerner. So I did not have the pull of sort of the Western pull saying, you're different. But the other, and just as important, is a lot of my interviews were under the auspices of the UNHCR, which is United Nations UN Human Refugee Council or something like that. And it gave me an official position. It gave me a distance, that I was able to be separate, because no matter what we say and do, and journalists have been trying forever and ever, it is really almost impossible to break the barrier between interviewer and interviewee. There is a wall there. It could be a glass wall, but it's still there. And I felt separate. And again, a lot of it is talked about in the book, and what the writer goes through. It's when I did most of my work with refugees for 4 years or 5 years, whatever it was, it was listening to their stories. In many ways, stories can be both engaging and can be a defense mechanism. I started, seeing not the people, but the stories they were telling. Um, and, again, that's one of the ways that humans interact. But I found it fascinating when I hit Lesbos, and it hit me like a ton of bricks, that I wasn't really interacting with refugees. I was interacting with their stories. Um, and that's one of the things that led me down into the spiral when I got to Lesbos. So yes, all these were separating. I mean, the wonderful thing about that interview with Kara, I mean, I love her, and there's a reason I love her, is that she started talking about her time of helping with, shall we say, the underprivileged in Brazil, and she had the same experiences of where does she belong and what wall can one hide behind. In my early work with the refugees, I was able to hide behind, I'm a writer. It's a persona I know really well. I observe, I write, I listen. I almost always want to say, I swear I'm a good listener. I swear I help people. But the truth is, I'm doing it from a position of power. In Lesbos, I arrived with no backing, with nothing. And I threw myself into the middle of a situation that was I was just another person. I couldn't hide. And that, shook me.
Yeah.
Um,
If you had asked me before you answered to imagine what what your answer was going to be, it was very different. Like I imagined, and I'm curious about it, is I imagine that maybe part of the difficulty was the sheer number of volunteers that you would be among in Lesbos versus perhaps in the more established camps in Beirut, there wouldn't be the tidal wave of volunteerism.
and in Lebanon, the whatever volunteerism was there was primarily local. Um, but I wasn't, most of my interviews were not particularly in camps. They were the Lebanese in the Syrians in Lebanon were not officially separated from the people of Lebanon. So they were everywhere. I met them everywhere. In Lesbos, there was this whole thing of the volunteers and who they were and why they were there, and then seeing that I had the problems that I had with the volunteers. Was repeating the same behavior, that I was there because I wanted the world to see me as someone who is caring, um, not about the refugees. And again, what happened sort of reinforced that idea that, no, I was there to help myself. Now, again, I will repeat that because, a lot of people get offended. And no, I don't mean that you shouldn't volunteer. You should volunteer. I've been volunteering all my life for many different things. But one has to be conscious about why one is doing it. And being in Lesbos and seeing it so blatant, because they were young and they were, open and they were wonderful. And I started seeing, the other side of volunteering, which is, they're on vacation. They're on vacation. And there's nothing wrong with that. I keep saying it's better to go on a vacation and help people than go on a vacation to an island by yourself. It's just a different way of behaving.
Yeah.
But yes, there was a big difference. And then I stopped working with after this I stopped working with refugees for a while, and then I was asked to go to Istanbul to work with this Syrian organization that is helping Syrians. And that I thought was one of the healthier models that I've seen, which is older refugees helping more recent arriving refugees. And it's a school, and it was magnificent. I mean, I thought it was wonderful.
Well, the book opens in, I think, a really interesting way. It opens at a moment on Lesbos where the weather has turned bad. that's when Mina's arriving. So the moment that Mina arrives, there actually aren't a lot of refugees arriving simply because of the weather, but the island is awash with a lot of restless volunteers milling about with no one to quote unquote save. So it really highlights something that's going on the island too. And some of the volunteers are like Mina, they're medical, but many of them, as you mentioned, they're on vacation. They're hybrid tourist volunteers in a sense. And you said to Kara that you kept saying to yourself that the volunteers were great people, but you also wanted to kill them. And but that you also say something that you just spoke to, but I want to read the quote from this too, because it's so interesting. And I also think it returns us back to identifying both as a refugee and as a volunteer at the same time yourself. That you kept telling yourself you were a good person, that you were there with good intentions, and therefore because of that, whatever you did was surely going to be good. And then to Kara you say, quote, "Then I realized I sounded like the United States of America. It was a stunning realization, like hitting a big wall. When people ask if it's a book about the refugees, I want to say, no, it's about me." And it just feels like there's so much to unpack in that one line. But it also makes me think of the review in the New York Times by Dina, where she says it's really rare in a novel to see the depiction of sort of the ugly side of certain volunteers. And I guess particularly the humiliations that they sometimes inflict as part of their performance of goodness. And you portray some of that in the book too. And I just wondered if you could speak to, you talked about the desire to hide behind a wall, but there's also some people who are reinforcing a wall or reinforcing a distance through their act of charity or disguised as an act of charity.
Yes. Again, the difference between like what the reviewer said and what I would say is I didn't see it that much as the ugly side of volunteering. I wanted to kill them, but I saw it as very natural in some ways.
Yeah.
Because I was doing the same thing as they were. It's part of being in many ways human. We unconsciously or consciously humiliate those who are less powerful than we are, and the big thing about, in my opinion, being a good human is to start to realize that, and you do work against doing that. But again, these kids were, I keep repeating, they were, some of the best that humans have to offer. They're taking time to go and help refugees. But at the same time, the first time I mentioned sort of a similar scene in the book. The first time it was the first night, and I was in this cafe eating by myself, and then there was a switch. And all of a sudden, this cafe with all these young college-age kids became a dating bar. Which is, when I think about it rationally, it's of course completely expected. They're, 19, 20, 21 in a strange place. They're excited because they're helping people, and they want to get laid. Who doesn't? At the time I was so flabbergasted, wait a second, where am I? There's this big disaster happening, and these kids, it was their night off. They wanted to get laid. And like I said, when I think about it rationally, and this makes absolutely perfect sense. When I was in the situation, it was like, we're having a disaster to end all disasters. And then I have to remind myself that actually during the disaster to end all disasters, people get laid.
Yes.
This is what happens.
I also wonder if we think about the people who have the most unimpeachable reasons to be there. Let's say Mina, a surgeon, they desperately need her skills. Everything that she's doing on the island is necessary and meaningful. You still have got to think that somebody motivated to become a surgeon and then become a surgeon who goes to Lesbos, it has, I don't know that it invalidates their service, that they also, it might be important to their notion of their self, that becoming this makes them feel good in some way.
Yeah, well, this is the in many ways the one of the major themes of the novel is that no, it does not, and this is what I keep trying to say, and that's why I will repeat that I don't see them as ugly or the ugly side of volunteering. They're human. They have many sides. When we started this conversation, I talk about, there's Mina who's me, there's the narrator who's me, there are the volunteers who are me, and stuff. We are all multiple versions of ourselves, and which ones come to the fore, it depends on the situation. I needed, when I was writing this book, I needed what the guy who sort of in real life saved me was this Iranian musician who's Swedish, and he kept telling me, I don't care what you're going through, I could put you to work. I don't care why you're here, I could put you to work. And he brought up the sort of okay, you pull up your britches and you go to work. We all have that, and we all have parts of us that are dizzy, and parts of us that want to get laid, and all that. It's all there. So what shows up and how that shows up is important. All I ask of myself most of the time is that I become conscious of what is happening. The reason that I had trouble personally in Lesbos as opposed to all the others was it hit me. When I was there, it hit me for the first time that I was not who I thought I was. I was not, I wasn't sure whether I was Lebanese or American, or, am I a good person? Am I a bad person? And all these things hit at the same time. And I thought that would make for an interesting novel, but I couldn't write it. I had to create another persona, which is also me, to come in and tell the story of me. So,
Which all this, you talking about this, all of it makes sense why you love Pessoa so much.
Oh my God, yes. Yes. I mean, he's like my idol. I know I have at least, like maybe 15 personas. He has 72.
Yeah. Well, you'll get there.
I got working.
Well, these questions of goodness, they remind me of some of the questions that Elisa Gabbard raised in her last book, The Unreality of Memory. And one of the things she explores is morality in relationship to information overload. And if I remember her book correctly, she talks about at the time of the first colonies in the United States, the first newspaper came out once every month. So that was like the speed of the news. And one of the thinkers she cites in the book wondered if it were perhaps easier to construct an achievable way to be moral within one's own valley if you didn't know all of the terrible things happening all the time 3 valleys over, or let alone across the ocean. And that for most of human history, most of the moral choices we would make would be based on an amount of information several orders of magnitude smaller and coming toward us more slowly. And I also was thinking about Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, where once all of the stability of sort of institutional and governmental structures have disappeared and people form these cohorts for self-defense, where quickly anyone who's outside of their newly formed group, they would defend against and even kill, simply because there were sort of limits to how many people could be considered quote unquote us and survive in this post-apocalyptic free-for-all that she created. These questions of memory and forgetting, there's something you tackled, I think, most head-on in your last novel, The Angel of History, where Jacob, who lived through the worst of the AIDS crisis, he forgets in order to continue living. And that book also engages with the drone wars in Yemen. And you've said it's partly a self-recrimination around the way you were able to go on living in the face of those drone wars. But I wonder if you feel that the amount we need to consider is at an impossible scale. But also, even if you do feel that, it does feel like your book is still suggesting, at least for yourself, but I don't think just for yourself, that we must face it. We must still consider it. But I'm interested in your thoughts about this perhaps human notion of when in overwhelm, we try to shield what we're willing to consider ultimately.
Yeah. But I wonder, again, if it's only an overwhelm. I mean, Octavia Butler's idea of the sower is the world we live in all the time. You know, we form groups and we form identities. And I mean, you know, I'm all for, in some ways, if you want to call it identity politics or whatever, but we have to remember that by forming these identities that separate us from those who are outside, we begin to behave in a monolithic way that is detrimental to those on the outside. Now, again, there's this whole thing of course, we have to, because the dominant culture is also, you know, monolithic, and it defines itself in a different way that excludes others. So there's this whole tension, but we just have to figure out a way of how do we deal with identity itself. Who is us and who is them, and why is, you know, this one part of our group and that one not? And unfortunately or fortunately, the need to belong sometimes, I think, overpowers everything, and we sacrifice a lot to belong to one group or one identity, or and we can't conceive of a bigger notion. You know, John Lennon was, you know, way ahead of his time. You know, imagine there's no nations, or because the world can't imagine it. We as humans cannot imagine an entire humanity and all of us in one group. We have to, you know, it's like we need an alien invasion to come in to we need an other, basically. We need somebody to be an other to bring us together. And every group needs it. The trouble is that we keep creating identities, and somebody has to be outside that identity, and that those people become the other, and we project all kinds of evil and mischief onto them. But how much can we consider from about the world? I think it was, I wrote this in my first book, and I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something like, you know, I imagine that the word sane means that thinking that this infinitesimal segment of the world is reality and the rest of it doesn't exist. And that's how we have to function, because, you know, the world is way too big. And yes, it's getting bigger with you know, all the technology that we have. We get to see more and stuff, and we have to protect ourselves, because I cannot see how we can live in a world with so much sorrow and be able to go on. But at the same time, we can't not think about it. Or at least, I guess most people can. I haven't been able to. And I don't know how to, you know, protect myself, and I don't know how to extend myself to be able to do anything other than watch. But I cannot see how it's like we're getting crazier and crazier, and or maybe we've always been, you know, I don't know. But I don't see how one can ignore so much injustice just so that you could, you know, watch good TV.
Yeah. Well, I want to take this question of scale into the realm of storytelling, because I think you do take this question of scale into the realm of storytelling in this book, which ultimately becomes a question of how to engage the reader. I'm going to read something from the Gornick as part of this question, and she's describing going to a funeral in this part of the situation in the story. A pioneering doctor died, and a large number of people spoke at her memorial service. Repeatedly, it was said by colleagues, patients, activists, and healthcare reform that the doctor had been tough, humane, brilliant, stimulating, and dominant, a stern teacher, a dynamite researcher, an astonishing listener. I sat among the silent mourners. Each speaker provoked in me a measure of thoughtfulness, sentiment, even regret. But only one among them, a doctor in her 40s who had been trained by the dead woman, moved me to that melancholy evocation of world and self that makes a single person's death feel large. The next morning, I awakened to find myself sitting bolt upright in bed, the eulogy standing in the air before me like a composition. That was it, I realized. It had been composed. That is what had made the difference. And this notion of making a single person's death feel large is, I think, one of the great strengths of The Wrong End of the Telescope for me. But it also feels like one of the coping mechanisms for Mina, the protagonist, as she's administering to people on Lesbos. She becomes particularly invested in the fate and the story of one family where the mother figure has late-stage cancer and is soldiering forward, hiding it from her kids as she tries to get them to Europe before she dies. And the book scope, like Mina's, comes down to the scale, to the fate of one family. And I guess I wondered if this, for you, was a storytelling technique so a reader could take in the scale where questions of dignity are on a level that one could parse and digest.
I mean, definitely. The one thing that struck in the last thing you said is that it's a storytelling technique. I don't know if it's a technique. It's how stories are told. No matter how big the story, it's always the story of individuals. The story of a country is the story of its people, individual peoples. It is. I assume it can be done, and I can't think of anything right now. But there are, of course, macro stories that tell the movements of people, and those are interesting, but not really. It is individuals. Now, we can go back to, yes, of course, the story of one person is the story of people. The story that's like, again, the personal is political. And so that, the story that I tell becomes political because it is a political story, but it's really the story of one person. Now, there are many other stories in the book of different people, but I'm interested in people. Like, I might disapprove of, the political regimes here or there, or whatever, but I'm much more interested in how that politic or how that regime affects people. It's like if I interview Syrian refugees, it's not to solve the political problem. It's to hear the story of people. I don't know. Again, going back to, I don't know if of a storytelling technique that doesn't involve singular stories.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. But there's another.
You go back to 1001 Nights, which is this big thing, but whenever you read it, you remember it's just the story of this person. Then it's the story of this person. You can tell a bigger story, but it's singular people.
Yeah, but there is a sense, I think. I don't know if this is. The sense of bringing things down in moments in the book to things where meaning is on a level that is easier to engage with. For instance, another one I'm thinking of is when the writer encounters a group of boys, refugees, who don't have the fare to get onto the ferry to go to the mainland Europe. And he isn't able to pay the tickets for everybody, but he's able to pay the tickets for some. he can get some of the people on the boat. So in this sense, can make a measurable, visible difference. In perhaps other ways, he's unclear what he's doing.
And that difference isn't much, unfortunately. And that's one of the scenes that, happened, with me, and it broke me, because there were, like 100 boys, and all of them, 15, maybe 16 at most, and you can't help them, you can't. So what does one do? But you again, not doing something is worse than doing something. But yes, it becomes a story of, it's like that scene in the novel is important to me, and it was important, in real life, because they were both a collective and individuals. So seeing them as individuals, and I remember their stories, and again, I make a joke about it in the novel, but I talked to at least 6 or 7 Muhammads in a group of 10. It's like they're all called Muhammad. Yet at the same time, they were all individuals. Again, in my head, I remember the guy in the lamb's wool sort of jacket that kept explaining to me that he's a shepherd, but he can do anything, and he was 13, 14 at most, by himself. But again, it's both a collective thing. You can see them, but maybe you could help, 1 or 2 or 10, or go into credit card debt for a while.
Yeah. Well, that scene really reminded me of my conversation with Jenny Erpenbeck. She too is writing about refugees.
Oh, I know. I loved her.
Yeah. But she's puncturing the narrative about what happens when refugees arrive in Europe, as if arriving in Europe was a happy ending. And I think that's probably what you're alluding to when you say it's not much, even getting them on the ferry. I mean, if we were to look at the numbers of refugees allowed into Germany, certainly compared to North America, but also compared to many countries in Europe, you might call Germany's immigration policy generous. But she tells the story of a refugee whose father was burned to death in Nigeria, and he ends up in Libya after that, where Black Africans were literally being hunted openly in the streets. He's forced onto a boat with his family to escape, and his 2 children die when the boat is capsized. And then when he makes it to Europe, despite being quite skilled, he isn't allowed to work. And she writes in his obituary, if you aren't allowed to work, you can never really arrive. And most of the refugees aren't really allowed to arrive. As I imagine these boys arriving on the boat with the help of the writer, I imagine that they're not going to be allowed to arrive. And I guess the impossibility of the situation, or the absurdity in the Camus sense of absurdity of the situation, made me think of an interview where you're talking, I think, to John Freeman, where you paraphrase a line from Calvino. And I found Calvino's original words too, and I liked your paraphrase and I liked the original, so I'm going to read both. Your paraphrase, the entire world is inferno, and to live well, you find people who are not inferno and you hold them close. In Calvino, the inferno of the living is not something that will be. If there is one, it is what is already here. The inferno where we live every day, that we form by being together. There are 2 ways to escape suffering it. The first is easy for many. Accept the inferno and become such a part of it that you can no longer see it. The second is risky and demands constant vigilance and apprehension. Seek and learn to recognize who and what in the midst of the inferno are not inferno, then make them endure, give them space. To me, I imagine this is sort of like and Alameddine, Ars Poetica. But I want to hear your thoughts about the doing better, being better than the not doing, which thinking of Camus again, of the doctor in that town during the plague. I mean, it's
I repeat that in the novel. I mean, the doctor who dresses up as a woman to go back and help, it's a how do you call it? A Camusian thing. Well, the weird part of this, that whole quote, I put in the middle of my third book, The Divine. It's smack in the middle of it, just in case anybody doesn't get what I'm trying to do in the book. It's an amazing thing. It's funny because I had to reread the book only 2 weeks ago because I'm teaching it in class, Invisible Cities. And what I completely forgot was that this quote is the last paragraph in the book. I mean, everything in the book, it's tangents and its weird architectural structure is to lead to that one paragraph. And I was floored the first time I read it. I was floored the second time, then the third time. But this time it was like, my Lord, this is probably what he's been writing about all his life. And I know that it's what I'm writing about. And I assume it's what a lot of writers write about, is how do you make, what makes us human endure? How do you make what we treasure a treasure? And it's I think an issue that I think every writer does, or at least I hope every writer does, and we all do it very differently. And I hope I do it with a sense of humor. But yes, it's how to, make what is loving in us endure, in spite of all the inferno that goes around. It's like, for most of us, it's been a hell of the last sort of 4 or 5 years. It's been really, really hell. I mean, I thought, it couldn't get worse than the refugee crisis. No, it can get worse. So how do we keep going, in a pandemic when people are insane, and let's call it what it is, when people are reverting to fascism, to outright fascism? How do you make what you love endure? It's a difficult thing.
Yeah. Could we hear the chapter, How to Make Liberace Jealous?
Oh, my. Oh, and that, by the way, is also true.
This story you're going to read?
Yeah. I met this woman, and she had a Liberace pantry. She was amazing. We only talked for like 15 minutes, but I loved her. She was so happy that I loved her pantry. And, and I went full camp mode, and she was like, oh my God, we're sisters. Yeah. Lebanon became home to the largest number of Syrian refugees and to the largest refugee population per capita in the world. In a country of 4 million, there were more than 1 million refugees, though the actual number was closer to 1.5 million. So much pain, so much destitution, so many refugees. And sometimes it seemed that you wanted to interview every one of them, to provide an ear for all the tales. I remember listening to you on the radio saying that there was nothing you could do to ameliorate the situation, that you felt helpless and pointless, but that you thought doing nothing would have been a crime. You could bear witness, you said. Observing was the one thing you knew how to do. If you could listen to their stories, maybe their stories could make sense. Only what was narrated could be understood. You traversed the country. Granted, it's a pygmy country. talking to all manners of Syrians. You went to different corners of Beirut, down south to Sidon, up north to Tripoli, to the west, beyond the mountains in the Bekaa Valley. What surprised me after I read the couple of essays you wrote were the details that stuck in my head, the idiosyncrasies of being human. I recalled some of the people in your writings and not others. I didn't remember much about the people you wrote about who were tortured, not much about the suffering of living as refugees. The woman with the sequin pantry, however, was one of those who remained ineradicable in my memory. Though she lived in a tent that had been erected in the middle of an onion field, she refused squalor. This gorgeous woman in her early 20s had an impeccably clean home that was decorated in an understated style, except in one respect, the tent's masterwork. She had studied her entire pantry with sequins, with results Liberace would have envied. You thought she must have spent untold hours gluing sparkles onto sheets of wood that would become a pantry to store non-perishables. Intricate and delicate, no spot left uncovered, so over the top that many a drag queen would kill for it. You desperately wanted it. You said she seemed embarrassed when she talked to you, admitting that it took her a long time to finish it, longer than she'd anticipated. What with caring for her forged offspring, cooking, cleaning, and tending to her husband and in-laws. It's good to have something beautiful to come home to, she said. The children love it. I do too, you said, with real appreciation. It's magnificent. She blushed, then beamed, a shy grin, and her eyes rose to meet yours. We had a ton of sequins, she said. In the essay, you wondered what kind of person would think it was a good idea to donate thousands of sequins to Syrian refugees who had nothing left, whose entire lives had been extirpated. Bright, shiny, gaudy, useless sequins. A fabulous one, of course. A lovely, most wonderful human being.
Been listening to Rabih Alameddine read from The Wrong End of the Telescope. If the only reason to hand the writing of this story from the writer to the surgeon was to create the Goldilocks distance, it sort of begs the question of why have the writer character at all? Because you could create that distance just by writing as the surgeon, I think. But at least for me, the secondary presence of the writer not only enriched the storytelling, the reading experience of the story, but it also raised a lot of questions about what storytelling does or doesn't do. On the one hand, you've talked often about the limits of empathy, and that even if a writer achieves empathy, there's no saying that feeling empathetic while you're reading is going to lead to anything tangible in terms of action or change. And in perhaps in that light, when John Freeman asked you who your ideal reader was for you, you said, fuck the reader. And that writing for you isn't about communication, that you write for yourself and that you have something to say to yourself. But on the other hand, it does in fact seem like the reader is on your mind. For example, in the same conversation with John, you say, quote, I couldn't care less if you empathize with my characters. I don't want people to read about AIDS and go, oh, that's nice, pass the beer. And then later you say, how can I get a reader not to feel what I would call preexisting emotions? And you've also talked in many places about wanting to break the wall between the reader and the subject, which I imagine might be related to your notion of preexisting emotions. And in the novel itself, there's this rare moment when the writer gets pinned down by the main characters in the book, because he's always sort of escaping being accounted for in the book. But at one point, he sort of gets trapped into a conversation in a restaurant that Mina describes what he says as follows. You tried to find a way to write about refugees and break the wall between reader and subject. You said you wanted people not to dismiss the suffering, not to read about the loss and feel sorry, feel bad for a minute or two, then go back to their glass of overly sweet Chardonnay. But you failed, of course. And then the first crack in your veneer, you said in a whisper that the only wall you broke was yours. So I guess I'm wanting to hear you talk about this seemingly contradictory stance between fuck the reader and how can I get the reader to feel something other than pre-existing emotions, and also what pre-existing emotions is in your mind in relation to this.
Let me talk about pre-existing emotions because that's the easy part. We're all programmed. We see certain things, we feel certain things. It's like if all I have to do is mention the Holocaust, and we all have these pre-existing feelings about them. It is the rare writer who could break through and tell you something new and make you feel something new about that. Same, with AIDS, same with, it's like the joke among writers for a long time is if you want the reader to care about your character, give them a dog. Because, we all know and have these feelings towards dogs that are pre-existing. It's like it's there. I mean, it could be for a cat or whatever, but it's a rare writer who could tell you about their love of their dog and make it brilliant. I keep thinking My Dog Tulip, J.R. Ackerley's book, which is the dog is such a disaster, but the writer actually thinks that it's the greatest dog in the world. So it introduced something completely new to the equation. And that's what I think every writer wants, is some form of connection. In the interview with Kara, I mentioned the first time we met when, I told her about the accident that my young nephew had at the time. And her reaction was so swift and so, for lack of a better word, genuine, that I felt right away a strong connection to her. And she had a strong connection to the story. And in my opinion, a book should do that, to have something authentic or genuine or original or whatever we want to call it, as opposed to the familiarity of feelings, which is what almost these days most writing is just familiar. It takes you down roads you've been there before. It's comforting and it is lovely. I'm not suggesting it's not. It's just, we've seen this before. It. It makes you feel comfortable. It's like wearing a nice sweater and in a cold day. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it, but I'm not interested in that. And in my opinion, that is not the province of literature. That's the province of writing. Literature is supposed to induce something different. It's supposed to, like great art, it's supposed to take you places you haven't been before, emotionally primarily, and intellectually, but emotionally primarily. So that's that. The, fuck the reader, and I want to fuck the reader. That's what I call it. Yes, it's a dichotomy, and it's two ends of a line or a continuum or whatever. And my first response is always this: so what? I contradict myself all the time. In the first section that I read, I say that yes, I want to fuck the reader because most of the time I don't care. I'm tired of writing that is supposed to please, make everybody feel happy, like I said, and comfortable, and at the same time, I do care because I want to, it's like I can't get a hold of a reader and slap them silly. So my next best thing is to write a book that does. And I don't mean it as a, this is a book that will, but to wake up some people, to wake up someone, to have something new, to have a frisson of excitement, as opposed to this, feeling of comfort and escapist, and again, I keep saying that it's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to escape and reading to escape. It's absolutely, necessary. And I keep thinking, I want to write a sort of a superhero dragon book with that, is predictable and it makes everybody feel good. I love them. Okay. But that's not exactly what I go for. I want to fuck with the reader. I want to fuck the reader and fuck the reader.
Well,
and my favorite books have fucked me over completely. Completely. It's like we're just talking about Invisible Cities. Here I am. I read it now, like 35 years after the first time I read it, and it fucked me up. I mean, what more? It's the Kafka quote. It's to break the frozen seas within you. Now, again, not every book should be that, and I mean, sometimes I get asked, what do you read? I read everything, including romance novels and, vampire novels, anything. I love genre fiction because, it makes me feel comfortable and it removes all the troubles of the day. But when I really want to read, I want something that will fuck me up.
Yeah. Well, maybe in that spirit, I want to talk about Satan.
Oh, God, yes. Let's talk about Satan.
Who was a character in your last book, but not portrayed the way we would normally have Satan portrayed. This is the Satan who will not bow down to Adam because Satan only has love for God. The Satan who says, all of those who say no, follow me. So you call him the saint, not just of gay men, but of all outsiders. And you've talked about the thing you most identify with in terms of identity is not being gay or Arab American. It is being someone not belonging anywhere or of being a misfit. That you're attracted to writers like Pessoa and Kafka and Walter Benjamin, who are also strange on the inside and the outside, and who understand what it means to be odd, which you described as to choose a life where one foot is in the world and one foot is in your own psyche. And you've also said that having one foot in two cultures, Lebanon and the U.S., is part of how you find the Goldilocks distance. And a way of being you've described in your first book, Kool-Aid's, as in America, you fit but do not belong, and in Lebanon, you belong but do not fit. But thinking of Satan in this light as a patron saint of the outsiders, and back to what writing can and can't do. When you were on the Arabology podcast about 5 years ago, you were talking about books of yours that were accepted for translation into Arabic, and then dropped due to their discovery of what you were actually writing about or controversies that came up around what you were writing about. And you said, wherever there is censorship, one must get censored. Otherwise, you're just diddling around. And you've also said that you're with Kafka when he says, we ought to read only the kind of books that wound or stab us. And it feels like your topics, whether it's AIDS or drone strikes or Syrian refugees, are very much in that spirit of speaking to power. But you also have been disturbed that these very same books by you have been embraced and celebrated, or at least been disturbed by how they've been embraced and celebrated at some point. So that your best-selling The Hakawati would be put forth as somehow representative of an entire culture, as one reviewer said, as a bridge to the Arab soul. But then when you wrote An Unnecessary Woman in response as a way to create a protagonist who couldn't be more different and couldn't be less concerned about audience or public opinion, that book too was embraced and loved, and perhaps even more so, and perhaps this even more defines you, or at least is one that people think about you with. And you have this great essay in Harper's called Comforting Myths, where you look at the way America metabolizes other voices and puts them forth as what you call the cute other, the other that it becomes the purveyor of comforting myths, perhaps even unwittingly. And you talk about how America celebrates global writing not by reading or foregrounding writers that are truly from different places, but almost exclusively writers like Salman Rushdie or Junot Diaz or yourself, who are Westerners, who are living in the West, who are connected often to academic institutions in the West. And you call these people the cute other. I guess this is my long way of asking, as a follower of Satan, of saying no, of being an outsider, and someone who wants to read and write books that will wound us and stab us, and yet as someone who fears they're getting metabolized as the cute other nonetheless. If you could just talk about this a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. It's just like, yes, I could talk about it. I could spend years talking about it. Let's start with Satan. Again, every group needs an other, and we other it, and so on. But primarily for me with Satan is that he just refused to go along. He had different ideas, and he gets vilified for that. And then we start, not we, but all of religion start projecting all kinds of evil onto the person. And there are a number of offshoots of religion that talk about not Satanist or Satanism as a religion, but the idea of what Satan or Iblis stands for, which is for me the ability to say no. And when we're living in times where God is a fascist in all senses of the word, it's this only through me you get to heaven, and that following Satan or saying no to that, saying no to, I refuse to be like you. I refuse to, live in inferno. Makes one sort of appreciate Satan, as I called him in the book, the first revolutionary. It's like all those who say no. So there's that. And yes, I fight, or I want to write in opposition to the dominant culture. It's in my nature. When I was a young boy, my friends used to call me the refusal front, which was a faction of the PLO that said no to everything, because whatever they suggested, I would say no. You want to play soccer? No. So my tendency is to go against what the group wants. So there's that. And at the same time, like I said, I can hold two opposing points of view, and I am in many ways two opposing things. I do want to be accepted. I do want to be read and validated, and I want to be loved. And if that means having to be the cute other, okay, I'll take it. I have that in abundance. So, like we said earlier, I'm at least 15 different personas. Not 72 yet, but I'm working on it. So yes, there's that as well. So it's a constant clash of being, wanting to reject everything and wanting to be accepted. So there's that. As terms of, the sort of essay, and I like that essay a lot, and I think about it all the time, and it's that for most Americans and for most readers and critics, I am the other as a writer. Yet the truth of the matter is I'm an American. Not just that I've been here since I was 17, so that's 45 years ago, but that most of my education, even when I was in Lebanon, is basically an American education. So that all the things that I accuse American literature with, I accuse myself. I am American literature. I'm not I am a part of American literature. Not all of it, okay?
Not yet.
Yet I intend to take over. Satan and I will one day rule American literature.
I hope so.
So, uh, and just you wait, somebody will use that quote. And then he said,
Watch out.
Watch out. Yeah. Yeah. So, that was my whole thing about the essay, is that I am being othered, even though I am part of the culture. So could you just imagine what happens to writers who are actually other, who are actually outside of the Western culture? They're completely, either completely ignored or hated. We don't allow that kind of literature in at all. So yes, there is a part of me that wants, to be the outsider, and a part of me that wants to be the insider. And I believe we all do. It's just, we're on different points at the scale.
Well, let me quote something you've said in the past that is related to this. And I'm curious about whether it applies to your latest book. You've said, one of the things that happens with me is that so far, every book I write is not just in response to the last book, but a rebellion against it. So is the wrong end of the telescope a rebellion against the angel of history? And,
Yes.
and if so, how?
Let's put it this way. It is the least rebellious against the former book. And I felt really guilty about that when I was writing this. I kept feeling, when I was writing the wrong end of the telescope, I kept feeling, I've done this before. God damn it, I've done this before. I'm using the same, it wasn't as big of a move, but it was definitely a rebellion. The Angel of History, even though it takes on a big subject, it's smaller in scope. It's about one writer, and yes, it's about his friends and what happened, and it's about the drone wars, and it's about AIDS and all that. But it's really just the internal life of one person, struggling to adjust to a weird world, and Satan keeps telling him that it's not you who's crazy, it's the world that's crazy. In this book, it's shall we say, outwardly directed. Yes, the writer, and that's, I guess, why it didn't work. The writer is having his drama, or drama, which sometimes is the same thing. But Mina is engaging the world, and she's engaging characters, and she's engaging people and situations. In the Angel of Histories, he doesn't. It's a smaller scope. It's a big story within someone's head in some ways. This is a big story that was in the narrator's head, but Mina does not allow it to continue to be so. So yes, it is in rebellion. But it wasn't in great rebellion, I keep saying, because really nobody read the Angel of History.
Oh, really?
No, I mean, it wasn't the most, like I said, every book does well. When it does well, I rebel against it.
Yeah.
The
maybe
Angel of
this one
History,
stabs more. Maybe
Sorry?
this one wounds or stabs in the way that you...
Well, the Angel of History at that time, I thought, was my best work. And it was not, I mean, it was well received by critics and stuff, but it didn't do well. It was too gay, too queer, too sexual and strange. And, Satan was a joy as opposed to, the evil person that he's supposed to be. It wasn't, I don't know how much it sells. I never figured, but I don't think it sold much. So I didn't feel a need to rebel against it that much, but I did.
Well, Satan's a joy in the Milton too.
Oh God, yes. He's the best thing in Milton.
Yes, by far. Well, I wanted to talk about writing from a perspective that isn't your subject position as a Lebanese-American gay man, something that you've long done. And you've often expressed surprise that people themselves are surprised that you would be able to create protagonists who are women. And you're asked about this a lot. In fact, most of the times that I've watched or listened to things with you, this is a topic that comes up. Sometimes from simple curiosity, but sometimes it comes from ignorance, where readers imagine there are not strong women in Arab cultures and thus are surprised to see strong women in your books. And you've said that the whole notion of write what you know is not just boring, but wrong. And that it seems like every novel now has to be a memoir. And it makes me think of the Zadie Smith piece, Fascinated to Presume, where she says, the old and never especially helpful adage, write what you know, has morphed into something more like a threat, stay in your lane. This principle permits the category of fiction, but really only to the extent that we acknowledge and confess that personal experience is inviolate and non-transferable. It concedes that personal experience may be displayed very carefully to the unlike us, to the stranger, even to the enemy, but insists it can never truly be shared by them. And then later she asks, what would our debates about fiction look like if our preferred verbal container for the phenomenon of writing about others was not cultural appropriation, but rather profound other fascination or even cross-epidermal reanimation? And she's also mentioned elsewhere that it's her character Alex Lee, who's half Chinese and half Jewish, that she feels is most like her, a person who is neither Chinese or Jewish. It also makes me think of something that I brought up with Abdullah Tayo when he was on the show. I had just watched him do a reading prior to him being on the show where he was about to talk to Colm Tobin, and he got up to read first, and he prefaced his reading by saying that he was going to read in the voice of Zahira, which was his female prostitute protagonist, which was not him. But then he stopped himself and said, no, actually, she is me, that he couldn't write except by pulling all that he knew and all of who he is into any character, including a female prostitute. So I guess I just wanted to have my long non-question introduce this question of the fiction and the other. If you could talk to us about this, particularly in relationship to this book, where our main character, while Lebanese-American, is a trans woman, lesbian doctor.
Sure, I can talk about it. Although why you'd want me to, because God damn it, Zadie is so much more eloquent than I am. And that was really well done. I like I said, I've said it now. I'm very rebellious. I say no. You tell me to stay in your lane, I say fuck you. It's as simple as that. The thing with me is that I actually rarely go out of my lane that much. Like I said, all my characters are sort of a variation of me. I had a lot more issues with this book writing about Mina as a surgeon than I did about Mina as a trans woman, lesbian. Surgeon was a much, much bigger obstacle in many ways to imagine what the life of a surgeon would be like, as opposed to the life of a trans woman lesbian. I spend almost all my time with trans women lesbians. It's not that difficult. It's not that difficult to imagine for me what it's like to be that out of the dominant culture. I could make so many jokes about this, and I know people take this so seriously, but really, I am a trans woman lesbian in a gay man's body. It never occurs to me to question whether I could write that. I spent hours and days questioning whether I could write about her as a surgeon, because that is so, for me, difficult to imagine. And I had to, talk to all kinds of people. I talked I had at least 7 different doctors sort of advising me the whole time. About the trans women, I had 2 of my close friends. They told me yes or no. But the idea that you can't or you're not allowed just goes contrary to everything I believe in. Now, a lot of the appropriation conversation is important to have. And yes, appropriation is a problem because it's an issue of power and who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak. The most of the people who are anti-appropriation, who believe that they can write about anything they want, are wrong. They can't. And the reason they can't is because they're terrible writers for the most part. But it's difficult because it's difficult for them to imagine what it's like. The whole, let's pick one, the controversy about American Dirt. There was a big problem of appropriation there, but it wasn't about a white woman writing about a Mexican woman. It's about a white woman writing badly about a Mexican woman, as in she was incapable of imagining what it was like to live as a Mexican woman. So she had to come up with stereotypes of just truly astoundingly bad stereotypes. When John Updike writes a book about an 18-year-old Egyptian American and calls it terrorist, it's a terrible book because nowhere in anything that Updike has experienced, I don't know what he lived his life, but he was not able to imagine what it's like for an 18-year-old Egyptian American. Now, I would have a lot of problems writing about, rabbit. It's not only not part of my experience, it would be difficult for me to imagine. That doesn't mean I'm staying in my lane. It means I know where I could imagine. I would have to do a hell of a lot of research to write about a straight, white, successful man living in suburbia. I cannot imagine anybody wanting to live in suburbia. So that for me, that is out of the question. Writing about somebody who lives in suburbia would be so much more difficult for me than writing about a trans woman. So it's about knowing, or at least how good is our imagination. The problem that I see right now is in this culture, really, it is coming full fore, is that we have a poverty of imagination. The writing, it's like all you'd have to do is go see movies now. It's like all the movies that come out of Hollywood are the same thing anymore. Nobody can even imagine another kind of movie being successful anymore because we stopped being able to imagine. Books tend to be, personal, confessional, and if they're personal, confessional that you can't identify with, forget about it. So it has to be a personal confessional of what's the topic du jour, what drama is happening today. That's what's happening. It's not about, appropriation. It's about a limited imagination that we're going through. And that's a problem. Now, again, that doesn't mean that appropriation should be ignored. On the contrary, we should talk about it, because for the most part, what most people who object to this whole discussion, it's about they don't want to be criticized. Well, if you write a book about somebody who's not like you and you do a terrible job, you are supposed to be criticized. You're not immune to it. The trouble is, are you able to do it?
Well, despite being a proponent of writing the imagined, or in addition to having this position, you did use sensitivity readers in the book. You do thank,
of course,
you do thank Susan Stryker, the the scholar and theorist of transgender studies, who's also your friend. Do
Because
you?
I stole her story.
Well,
A lot of her backstory is Mina's backstory.
oh, interesting. Well,
Yeah.
do you? I mean, maybe the answer to this question is going to be both or neither. But do you see the use of sensitivity readers as a way to avoid inadvertent harm, or as a way to make sure you're getting the details right?
Oh, I again that inadvertent harm thing is rankles a little. Um, you know, I am not responsible for someone else's harm. We've gotten to the point again where everybody becomes a victim, and oh my God, my feelings were hurt. Or, well, honey, again, get over it. I mean, again, it's my feelings are my own. I'm responsible for them, and that doesn't mean that you're not an asshole if you insult me, but that's your problem. Uh, no, and it's not about inadvertent harm. It's about making the best novel that I can. I don't give it to sensitivity readers. I give it to people who can help me edit the novel. Susan was not, it's like there were some things that she corrected that I would not know. I would not have known. She's someone who is trans and has gone through experiences that I cannot even begin. I would miss so many things if not for her. But I don't see it as sensitivity. I hate that word. I'm not sensitive. I see it as, making my novel better, making my novel more true, or to feel more true, making it better. I showed it to at least 3 different doctors.
Yeah.
Like I said, nobody goes, "Oh my God, they're sensitivity, readers." No, they're just trying to make I mean, they're actually harsher than most trans women I know.
Yeah. Well, I liked Susan's comments about the book, about how she found it particularly gratifying that your portrayal of Mina was understated in how it handled her identity, and that you didn't make her transness a battlefield for the culture wars. It was just an unproblematic perspective from which you told the story. And she says it was refreshing to encounter trans characters in the book whose gender identity wasn't their overriding story, and that their transition wasn't centered as the only story about them. But the thing that leapt out also was she liked that because trans people are so often portrayed as deceptive or as deceivers, to see trans people in the wrong end of the telescope doing deeply moral humanitarian work seemed noteworthy to her. But while you don't focus on Mina or the other trans characters in relationship to their acts of transition, or you don't focus on their acts of transition in a way that Susan Stryker found admirable, there are motifs of crossing borders in the book that aren't about transness. I'm thinking of the cross-dressing Greek man on Lesbos who continues as a sort of secondary background character in the town, but also the story which you referred to earlier of in Syria under Daesh, where Daesh isn't allowing male doctors to treat women. So the doctor does 2 calls to the same house, once dressed as a man and another dressed as a woman. Can you talk about what the presence of these non-trans characters who are nevertheless crossing boundaries? What role do you see their presence is playing, or their stories playing within the book?
I mean, again, in many ways, the whole book is about crossing boundaries, going from one place to the next. And these, it's like whether they're trans or not trans or whatever, we're constantly moving. It is not incidental to the novel that Mina is trans. But at the same time, her transness is not what defines Mina. Susan is one of my closest friends. I rarely think of her as trans. She's not my trans friend. I have many. They would kill me if I said Susan was my trans. But it's like, yes, her transness is part of who she is. I mean, it's a big part of who she is, but her story encompasses more. It never occurred to me to make the story about Mina's transness. That in many ways would be a limited and boring story. It's about her engagement with the world. So you include other characters. One of the things that, I mean, is a, now this is a trick as opposed to the earlier, that and I learned it from one of my earlier books, if the character is a minority or is outside of the dominant culture, when the dominant culture reads the book, they will assign all the qualities of that character onto the rest of the population. So if you write about a queer Arab and that character behaves in a certain way, the dominant culture and reviewers in general will start assigning that character's behavior to an entire class of people. All gay Arabs behave that way. So what needs to be done in terms of storytelling is, if I'm writing about a trans character, I don't want everyone to believe that the reason she does this or she's able to work with this person is because she's trans. So what you do is you just include variations of different things. I mean, for me, one of my favorite characters is Emma, who's also trans, but she's almost the complete opposite of Mina. And I wanted a predatory, fun, trans woman who wants to fuck every straight boy there is. It's like, yes, I could see that. And that's not Mina. One of the things, like I said, I start thinking is, if there is, Mina is in a long-term relationship, married for over 30 years, that, there's not much that is sexual about her. And I didn't want anybody to assume that trans people can be sexual. So you have Emma that comes to the rescue and reminds people, oh no, we can have sex.
Well, that makes me think, when I read Rebecca Mackay's blurb for your book, and it ends with, and it's a whole lot of fun, or something like that. I don't know that I would call The Wrong End of the Telescope fun exactly, but I do think
you should call it fun. It sells more books.
But I do think it points to something that doesn't get captured when we discuss just the broad topics of the book. That the book is a warm and full of love and entertaining. And I do think that's the prominent tone of the book. Like, I'm thinking of, in one conversation about your life in San Francisco during the worst part of the AIDS crisis, where by the mid-90s, half of your soccer team had died. You mentioned how the lesbian community was incredible, that how they were continually showing up in meaningful and unexpected ways. And when I think about that in relationship to all of our discussion about the limitations of writing, or the limitations of empathy, or the limitations of being a volunteer, or the impossibility of making a difference, it wouldn't be right to not mention the many really heartening and heart-opening relationships in this book. And many of them are centered
that actually make a difference.
That do make a difference. Yeah. And I mean, I think of Mina and her brother, which is just this remarkable relationship on the page. And I think about Mina and her relationship with her partner, Francine, back in Chicago, who's, I mean, you could say she's a minor character, but their relationship does not feel minor in the book at all.
She's not a minor character.
No.
I mean, again, she's in the background, but she's not a minor character.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like I said, I'm full of contradictions. I actually believe we make no difference. And then at the same time, I believe we make a lot of difference. I mean, all you have to do to get me crying is to mention, my lesbian friends. They weren't friends at the time, who just, at our worst moment, they showed up, and they showed up in full.
Yeah.
You can't talk. I cannot talk about it without remembering, what the fuck? Where did they come from? Where are they? Why? And when nobody else wanted to be around, they came.
Yeah.
So no. Again, sorry, it's a difficult time. But again, it's like, yes, we can't make a difference in terms of crisis. But then you look at, seriously, going back to look at the volunteers who went. I mean, the number of people who went to help refugees is amazing. The number of people who's, all of a sudden became fascist and closed the borders and stuff. There's a lot more of them, but you can't forget that as bad as I'm, sometimes talk about the volunteers, they're amazing, that they actually think that they can make a difference. Yes.
Yeah, and Mina's brother is amazing, and Mina's partner is amazing too, I think.
I also wanted, I don't know why I insisted on Mina being surrounded by love, and that she's such a loving person. It needed to be. It's like there was no way. She needed to have that. She needed, her brother's love as a storyteller, as a story, not just. She needed to be in a solid, loving relationship, so that, to contrast in some ways what happened to the writer and how she was able to extend to him what he didn't seem to have.
Well, let's return to the title of the book, which you alluded to earlier on, because many of your titles are references to writers. The Angel of History comes from Walter Benjamin's famous engagement with the Angel of History. An Unnecessary Woman is in conversation with the way Bruno Schulz was considered a necessary Jew kept alive during the war so he could complete a mural for a Nazi's daughter's bedroom wall. And The Wrong End of the Telescope, if I'm to trust your Twitter account, comes from a quote from D.H. Lawrence that goes, "It's easy to love America passionately when you look at it through the wrong end of the telescope." Talk to us about why The Wrong End of the Telescope is the right title for this book.
Well, there's part of that. Part of the answer to the question is inexplicable, as in, it just felt right from the beginning, but it does come from that quote. But to me, D.H. Lawrence, that was in the book Studies in Classical American Literature, which is a brilliant book that I think he wrote while drunk in 5 days because he needed money. And it's probably, in my opinion, probably his best book. And it's like this small. But it says that about, the writers who love America. And it says, it's easy to love America passionately when you look at it through the wrong end of the telescope. But for me, this book is not about America per se. So it's not about looking at America through the wrong end of the telescope. Is that we look at everything from the wrong end of the telescope. It is one of the things that keeps us sane, is to distance some things, to look at it as if it's the other. And in this book, it's the right title, because even though I am looking at the refugees situation, and you used in the beginning of this talk, you used the word that the book grapples with something. And I thought, yes, I grapple sort of like Jacob and the angels. Like it's grappling, but you don't ever get a hold of it. But it grapples with the refugee situation, but it really is the story of Mina, the story of Sumaya, the story of the narrator, who is not me, but me. It's once we start looking at people as people, not as the other, and not as a collection or a class, it changes things. I hope it changes things. So I wanted to look at the refugee situation, but I did not want to look at the refugee situation. I wanted to look at the refugees. So again, as single stories.
Well, there's a moment when the writer character decides he's not going to write another book about refugees for Western entertainment. And a friend of his suggests something that's brilliant, I think, that maybe he could write something that would allow the displaced people, the refugees, to inhabit the skin of Americans, allowing them to walk around in their fashionable clothes, empathize with their boredom and their angst, and where they could drama shop and go crisis touring themselves. Just so amazing to imagine. If this real writer before me today is not going to write about refugees either, do you know how your next book is going to rebel against the wrong end of the telescope?
I have to start at the next book. In like I said, most of my books are rebellion against that. That kind of book was an unnecessary woman, about a Lebanese woman living in Beirut, that even though she translates Western literature and stuff, but has nothing to do with America. And would Americans read it and feel some empathy towards non-Americans? I always wondered, but apparently they do. It still stuns me at times to listen to people going like, it's such a tragic situation she's in. She lives in such a patriarchal society. And I look and think like, and we live in what kind of society? That is like, unless she's married or have kids, then she's ignored. And that's not the case over here. It's like, So yes, I do that. I don't know what my next novel is. What I'm working on right now doesn't seem to be coalescing right now. And I'm blaming the pandemic still. I don't know. Something will come up, and yes, it will be a rebellion, most probably, and I'm hoping it's a smaller book. Like, do I really have to tackle the refugee situations? Like, can I just write a little nice book about, two people who have lunch?
I love it.
Me too. Without Satan coming to
no
screw
Satan.
Their lunch up.
Okay. Could we end with a reading of the chapter "The Cave of Shanidar"?
Oh my, okay. Sort of the hopeful chapter.
Yes and no.
Yeah, no. There's never a straight answer with me. The Cave of Shanidar. In spite of quite a bit of evidence to the contrary, I like to think of the world as kind, of humanity as decent, if flawed. My misinterpretation of the just world fallacy. I like to think that we humans try to do the right thing. Between 1957 and 1961, at a burial site inside a cave called Shanidar in northern Iraq, archaeologists discovered the fossilized remains of 8 adult and 2 infant Neanderthals, dating from around 65,000 to 35,000 years ago. Found with them were hundreds of stone tools, as well as bones of wild goats and tortoises. 9 of the 10 remains were lost, along with 15,000 cultural artifacts during the mess of shock and awe in 2003, where US forces invaded the country, destroyed the infrastructure, and chose to protect the oil ministry building, but not the National Museum of Iraq. The most famous of the 10 Neanderthals was the one who was discovered first, called Shanidar I, but known as Nandi among his excavators. He was remarkably old for a Neanderthal, somewhere between 40 and 50, yet he displayed severe trauma-related deformities. He had a withered right arm, no hand or forearm, and a deformed right leg. He was also apparently deaf, as his ear canals were blocked by exostosis. His day-to-day life must have been excruciatingly painful, yet he was seemingly cared for by the community. Among the numerous discoveries at the burial site were clumps of pollen representing a large variety of flowers, from grape hyacinth to yarrow. A debate still rages among archaeologists whether these flowers were part of the Neanderthal burial rites or were introduced to the site by gerds, a variety of rodent. I prefer to think that my ancestor and yours would care for the weakest among them and then bury him with garlands of flowers. Go, dear one, we send you away with yellow cockspur and daisies, cornflowers and hyacinths. Shanidar III does not have a nickname that I know of. He is in the United States at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, an immigrant. He too was between 40 and 50 years old and was found in the same grave as Nandi. He had a wound to the left ninth rib, a severe cut deep enough to have collapsed his lung. Shanidar III is the oldest known individual who was presumably murdered. My ancestors and yours were also killers.
Thank you so much, Rabih, for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are talking today to Rabih Alameddine about his latest book, The Wrong End of the Telescope. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength, makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. More of Rabih Alameddine can be found at rabihalameddine.com. And if you are on Twitter, be sure to seek out and follow Rabih's incredible curation of paintings and poems there. Rabih adds a short discussion and reading of Fernando Pessoa to the bonus audio archive. This joins supplemental readings by everyone from Garth Greenwell and Victoria Chang to Jory Graham and Teju Cole, craft talks from Jeannie Vanasco to Marlon James, and much more. To find out how to subscribe to the bonus audio and about the many other potential benefits of becoming a listener supporter, head over to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or, if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogi in the book division, Jacob Falla in the art department, Becky Kramer in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the summer and winter Tin House Writers Workshops. And finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating this outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog, A Sapatita Me, can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.